Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this BSI launch event for ISO 19650 Part 4. I'm Howell Davis, and I chair the BSI Technical Committee that has been responsible for BSI's input to the standard, and in my day job I'm Technical Director at CIBSE, the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. A couple of bits of housekeeping for those who are in the room. If there is any fire alarm, we're going to take it entirely seriously because there is no practice intended, and we leave by the way that we came into the room and go out through the entrance and we assemble in Tavistock Square. I hope that notice will be completely redundant. If anybody needs the facilities, they're out of the door immediately to my right. Take a right and they're through the double doors ahead of you. I think that's the only housekeeping that I've got, and so it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers this evening. And we have three people who've been very closely involved in the development of the standard. Dan Rossiter is the sector lead at BSI in the built environment, and he focuses particularly on digital activities. And Dan will be leading us off this evening. He's then going to be followed by Sarah Davidson, who is going to present to us online. And Sarah has been heavily involved in the development of the UK BIM Framework guidance. I'd like to stress the UK BIM Framework has actually been developed over a number of years, very much by industry, for industry. And I do commend the framework to you. For those of you who are familiar with it, Sarah will be giving you more background, and for those who are not familiar, it will be a really helpful introduction to a very important toolkit. And then finally, Nick Nisbet is going to be telling us more about the standard itself, which deals with information exchange in some detail. Nick has been the lead technical author for the standard and has been working on it well over a year or two now. And Nick will be explaining it in some detail. And then when we've had the three presentations, we are going to have a panel session and take questions. I believe there is an online facility for those who are joining us online. So without any more ado, I'm going to ask Dan Rossiter, Sector Lead at BSI, to come and give us his introduction. Dan.
Thank you, Howell, and good evening to everyone who's joined us physically, as well as those who have joined us virtually online. Yeah, so I'm Dan Rossiter, Sector Lead at the British Standards Institution and incoming Vice President Technical for the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists. What I wanted to talk to you about today is the relationship between the UK BIM Framework, the new information management mandate, and some key government documents, such as the construction playbook. Now, some of us will remember back in the yesteryears of 2010, 2011, when this now sort of infamous quote came out from the government strategy paper, which spoke about how government, as a client, can drive significant improvements in cost, value, and carbon performance through the use of open, shareable asset information. They did so thinking that there were key priorities based on the fact that construction projects at the time, and arguably now still, are often over budget and overrun. The fact that we are trying and striving to reach our targets for the Climate Change Act, looking at a 80% reduction by the year 2050, as well as the fact that we are trying to focus on improving value and trying to get the most out of what we produce, manage, and maintain. In order to do so, we saw a number of avenues that could be taken as part of a push-pull methodology. From a push point of view, how to try and make it easier for industry, the idea was to speak to software vendors in terms of how to make sure the software was fit for purpose, talk to training providers to ensure that the right training was available to upskill and develop the competencies needed, and also to develop the right standards, methods, and procedures to have in place in preparation for what was the initial government mandate for 2016. At the same time, there was going to be a pull methodology, how to actually force people up to meet those requirements. And that was through the government specifying on projects that people needed to meet a certain benchmark in order to do so. So effectively, by one, creating a benchmark, and two, providing the help to get people there, there was hope of real adoption in industry. As such, what happened was we had the then construction strategy, where the Cabinet Office mentioned specifically they'd work with British standards to develop a set of standards to help support what would be the mandate at the time, listed here in 232, talking about this idea of a fully collaborative 3D BIM. I'm sure we all know what that means, or as a minimum by the year 2016. And from there, we saw a wealth of standards being developed. These are known these days typically as the PAS 1192 series, where we saw standards relating to how we operated in the delivery phase, so how we operated during the briefing, design and construction, how we operated during the operational phase in terms of repair, maintenance and refurbishment, the ideas of how to use COBie, later on security mindedness, and ultimately how to support operability in how those who manage and operate buildings can inform those who design and construct. As part of that process, other tools were developed, including Uniclass and resources such as the BIM protocol, which built us up in preparation for that 2016 mandate. However, the story doesn't finish there. After the success of the original mandate, interest was seen internationally. The UK was showing clear leadership in this space, and there was interest to take that abroad. In effect, BIM went global. As part of that process, there were suggestions that we could take the UK-specific documents, the PAS 92 series, and elevate them internationally into the 19650 series. What happened there was many of the UK documents were used as seed content to produce international standards. And you can see how many of the parts equate over well, where Part 2 from the PAS 1192 series and 19650 both relate to delivery, briefing, design and construction, Part 3 operation, and Part 5 with security mindedness. Clear parallels between the two. In fact, this is a track record that we at BSI have with other documents such as PAS 55 becoming ISO 55000, and many of the smart city PASs being elevated to ISO as well. As part of that process then, we were beginning to show clear leadership in this space, which meant that as other countries started to adopt the ISO 19650 series, the UK were able to show upwards of 5 or even 10 years of experience in some places in using some of these practices, where some other countries were just beginning to develop their competence. Now, this has culminated in a set of resources that we call the UK BIM Framework. The UK BIM Framework, co-convened by the British Standards Institution and NEMA, is the overarching approach to implementing information management using BIM in the UK. And it broadly consists of three things: standards, guidance, and resources. Now, when Sarah speaks later, she'll provide more detail on what those standards, guidance, and resources are. What I will say is that while the name itself is static, the content within it is dynamic. And the idea being that as new standards are published, as new guidance is revised, as new tools are developed, they can be incorporated into the framework. So it's a dynamic wrapper. As that new content appears, you might see things shift and change. And just as we are talking about the release of 19650 Part 4 today, we're also talking about its incorporation into the framework. Which is why one of the reasons why it's so important to stay on the website and keep abreast of any updates on the framework as things constantly shift. The guidance is on a quarterly review, I believe, quarterly adjacent review process. So there's new content often that comes into it, and recently we've incorporated things like checklists and other bits and pieces as well. So it's well worth a look. Now, the reason I'm talking about it is because of what is colloquially I've referred to it as is the three amigos. We now have three key documents from government talking about its policy in relation to the built environment. We have the National Infrastructure Strategy, we have Transforming Infrastructure Performance, and we have the Construction Playbook. And the three of them together are effectively a triad, referencing each other, talking about shared goals and vision that UK government has for its aspirations for the built environment. Looking at some of the content within it, the National Infrastructure Strategy, for example, talks about how we have contributed to the UK economy and how we support over 2 million jobs and the significance of the built environment in that way. It references clearly that at some point the construction playbook and the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap will be released in that way of signposting to these documents as they were under development. And it made clear within it that good decision making relating to our national infrastructure is underpinned by clear and accessible data. And both on the nature of the problems they're trying to solve and on its performance, we need that good information in order to leverage and exploit it. So it's clear that from an infrastructure point of view, needing good, accessible information is vital. Extending that further, we got to see what was in the construction playbook. The construction playbook delved a little deeper. It talked about the fact now that if you are a contracting authority, so someone who is effectively spending public money, and according to the latest ONS data, with my very small pie chart you can see in the top corner, roughly about a third of spend is public money at the moment. As part of that, if you were contracting for spending some of that, you should use the UK BIM Framework. And the idea is to use it to help support classifying data, securing that data, and data exchange, with 19650 Part 4 being specifically about the exchange of that data. And the idea is that it ultimately could support other initiatives such as the Information Management Framework and the creation of a national digital twin. So not only are we talking about now, but we're talking about aspirations for the future within there too. As part of this idea that there are certain requirements put in there, and from speaking to some government officials, the idea was it was on a comply or explain basis. You should do it, and if you haven't do it, then you probably should give a very good reason as to why not. As part of that, it talks about this idea that as part of embedding these digital technologies, through the use of things like the UK BIM Framework and ultimately the National Digital Twin Programme, we might be able to improve performance, sustainability and value for projects. And what I find quite interesting about that is that it is strikingly similar to that initial statement I showed up at the start of my presentation from 2011, and which I've put at the bottom there. You can see there on cost, value and carbon performance. So even though we are 10, 11 years later, we are still talking about the same objectives, and there's still confidence from government that these standards, this standard development process and information management can help achieve these goals, which I think shows great confidence in the direction that we've taken. And ultimately, in terms of getting a bit more detail about what's happening and how we do it, we can look at the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap. Within, it talks about the information management mandate and makes it clear that those working for government who are trying to do the UK BIM Framework and achieve the requirements within the construction playbook should do so by following the mandate in Annex B. As part of that process, it sort of then starts to connect these things together by having National Infrastructure Strategy reference the TIP roadmap and the playbook referencing the TIP roadmap, and they're all being quite circular and very interrelated in that way. Now, of course, this relates to central government. We have devolved governments in the UK as well, and there are procurement policies that relate to using BIM for their own public spend projects as well. Those of you in Scotland might be interested in SSPN 01 2017. So for the last 5 years or so, I've required BIM on projects that are worth over around 2 million. In Northern Ireland, there's policies requiring it over 4.1, and then in my own home country, Wales, moving swiftly on. Regardless, there are different policies in different parts of the UK to do so. And when you look at the TIP roadmap and the mandate, what it asks you to do, it's fairly clear in what it's asking. The first thing it asks you to do is to conform to the UK BIM Framework standards. It makes it clear that any standards that are listed as part of the UK BIM Framework form part of this mandate, which means that we have to be very careful in, one, making sure that the right standards appear to achieve the objectives within the construction playbook and transforming infrastructure performance, and also make sure that there aren't too many in there, that it becomes a cost burden or too difficult, and that it puts some of those objectives in jeopardy. The idea that all projects should go through the sensitivity assessment in ISO 19650 Part 5, that there needs to be the capability to undertake the information management function, either within government's own organisation or through the use of third parties or the delegation of those responsibilities onto others. defining their own information requirements, simply put, stating what you want. The idea of having some digital mechanism to store this information through something such as a common data environment solution. Specifying these as part of contract documents. So not just asking for it, but ensuring that actually it is part of the contractual relationship. You will do this. It makes it as important as delivering that building or that piece of infrastructure. And ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, ensuring that the same rigor is applied in maintaining that information. Because even though it might be right at the point of delivery, at the point of handover, if that information isn't maintained and kept valid as a true representation of that physical asset, then effectively it becomes worthless. Ultimately, as part of this process, this is why, one, we are focusing on those government documents and their relationships, as well as what the UK BIM Framework is and the power that it can hold to achieve those objectives and meet better information management. I'm going to pause there, and what I'm going to do is introduce Sarah Davidson and her video, which I believe that we should be able to start right about now.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Davidson, and I'd just like to spend the next 10 minutes or so of your time just explaining about a little bit more about the UK BIM Framework and the scope of the guidance and what's coming up. So I'm an academic at the University of Nottingham, and I joined the university back in 2018. But before then, I'd worked in the construction industry for a very long time. I'm also a member of NEMA, so you might be more familiar with NEMA as the UK BIM Alliance, and I'm also a member of the UK BIM Framework Steering Group. Now, up until the summer, I was part of the drafting panel for BS 8536. That's now been released, so that job is now finished. But I'm also a member of the panel responsible for drafting of ISO 19650 guidance, which of course is what I'm here to talk to you about. So my main role as part of that panel is being a member of the editing team, but it is by no means a solo endeavour. So I work with David Churcher of Hitherwood Consulting and Anne Kemp from Atkins, and together we have taken on this editing responsibility for all of the guidance and resources that are published through the UK BIM Framework website. But the production of those guidance and resources is quite a huge task. And since 2018, we've been working with a brilliant team of industry experts who are involved in authoring content and providing feedback on the guidance to make sure that it is robust and does stand up and does reflect real life experiences. So we've got about 40 to 50 people, technical experts from across the UK that we work with regularly so that we can progress the guidance. Now, when we talk about information management using building information modelling, what do we really mean? Well, we are talking about the standards that form part of the UK BIM framework, and those standards are primarily, but not only, the BSEN ISO 19650 series of standards. Now, what they do is they set out the processes that us as people working in the built environment can adopt, so that we can generate and exchange and use data and information really effectively. And to do that, we need to use technology. So technology also comes into that picture as well. Now, when we look at a definition of information management using BIM, we can see that we've got quite a nice, neat one published in Transforming Infrastructure Performance, the Roadmap to 2030 that was published last year. And that says that we're talking about generating, visualizing, exchanging, assuring, and of course, using and reusing data and information so that it is a trustworthy and reliable foundation for decision making, and so that it can be used to the benefit of all of those people who are involved in any part of an asset's life cycle. So in terms of the standards, let's just take a little bit of a look at what they are. So I've mentioned the BSEN ISO 19650 suite, and currently we've got parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you will be learning a lot more about part 5 tonight through Nick's presentation. Sorry, not part 5, part 4, and that's the one that has most recently been released over the summer. Now, also part of that suite is PAS 1192 Part 6, which I think goes back to 2018. That's the only remaining publicly available specification that sits within the UK BIM framework. And over the next year or 2 years, that will be superseded by an ISO 19650 part. Now, in the summer as well, we had the release of BS 8536 2022, which I've mentioned earlier, and that supersedes parts 1 and 2. Part 1, I think, was published in 2015 and part 2, 2016. And that is all about design, manufacture and construction for operability. And the suite of standards isn't static. So over time, more standards will be introduced into the UK BIM framework. But we have to make sure that we introduce standards that are going to be beneficial, are going to really help us improve our transformation to become a digital based built environment. So you might be thinking, well, really, how can the UK BIM framework help us? Well, it's worth thinking about asset information and a few key points, and there are going to be others, but just ones that I've picked up on. Asset information, it evolves over time through different activities that are undertaken through design, construction and operation phases of an asset. And that information has to serve one or more purposes, and therefore it has significant value. Now, because of those points, the information at any point in time has to be reliable for the purpose it's serving. It has to be accessible by the people that need it. So it needs to be in the right form, in the right format, available through the right technologies, and it needs to be suitably detailed for that purpose as well. Now, in addition to that, information generator and the information itself, they become detached over time, and we need to be able to rely on the information as a standalone asset without that generator backing it up. So the information has to be robust over time so that it can be relied upon. Now, when we look at the BS-EN ISO 19650 suite of standards, I've already given you a very brief overview or numbered them. So just to be very clear, part 1 is all about the concepts of information management using building information modeling, one of the first to be released in December 2018 or January 2019 for the BS version. And at the same time, part 2 was released, which is all around how the processes that we need for design and construction phase of built assets, so the delivery phase of built assets. Later, we saw the publication of BS-EN ISO 19650 Part 3, and that covers the operational activities and how we manage information that is generated through those operational activities. Now, Part 4, which is the most recent one to be released, that tells us or helps us understand more about the process of information exchange. And then we've got ISO 19650 Part 5, which was released in 2020, I think, which is all around taking a security-minded approach. Now, when we look at all of those 5 standards and we look at the process of requiring data and information and then planning for its delivery, generating it, approving it, authorizing it, and accepting it, those standards underpin those processes which are all about management and production of data and information. Of course, we've then got to use that data and information and learn from it and publish that or push that learning into the next information-based activity that we're involved in. So when we look at which standards to use and when, well, ISO 19650 Part 1, that tells us all the general stuff. So the principles, for instance, of a common data environment, or the principles of producing information and exchanging it and using it. When we're in the design and construction phases, or we're preparing for those design and construction phases of a project, then that's when we're going to look towards ISO 19650 Part 2. So that takes us right from the very first stage of working out why we need information, going through the detailed activity so that we can exchange and then use information. Now, ISO 19650 Part 3, the processes in that standard are very similar to those in 19650 Part 2, but they're being applied through the operational phase of a built asset. And there may be some operational phase activities that are really quite substantial. And it might be that although we're in the operational phase, we decide to use the detail that's set out in ISO 19650 Part 2. Now, ISO 19650 Part 4, all about information exchange. Information exchange occurs in both Parts 2 and Parts 3. And ISO 19650 Part 4 offers another layer of detail onto that information exchange process. And so underpins both standards, as does ISO 19650 Part 5, the standard that helps us implement a security-minded approach. Now, the guidance follows a very similar structure to the standards. So we've got Part 1 guidance that sits across all of the standards and is naturally high level. It's telling us about the concepts. And then we've got guidance Parts 2 and guidance Part 3, which tell us about the detailed requirements of ISO 19650 Part 2 and ISO 19650 Part 3. I'm going to talk about guidance for Part 4 in just a moment, and we've got guidance for Part 5 that is available through the CPNI website. Now, there are processes and ways of working that underpin all of those standards, and those processes and ways of working are explained or expressed in guidances Part A to F. Now, you might be thinking, well, really, why do we need guidance? Because the standards are very detailed in themselves and are really quite robust documents. But we need the guidance because they are very technical, and we need to have insight into how we implement those very technical requirements, and also of examples, so that people are encouraged, compelled, convinced to make that move towards digital transformation and to implement the UK BIM framework. Now, in terms of what recent updates to the guidance that's available, we've recently published a series of FAQs, primarily to cover information containers and working in common data environment, because earlier in the year we had the updated National Annex to ISO 19650 Part 2, and there were a number of questions that came out of that. And rather than bury those necessarily in guidance, what we thought it might be helpful to do is take an FAQs approach, and we'll be extending that FAQs approach into additional themes as we get more feedback and as we start to understand more about what the detailed issues and uncertainties might be. Now, we've also been working on a project this year to help us go about the production of the resources that underpin the UK BIM framework. So things like including the information standard, the exchange information requirements, information production methods and procedures, and the checklists help us to understand, to make sure that those documents, those resources are robust in themselves. And so they'll ask questions like, have you considered X, Y, and Z? And those checklists will also link back to guidance if you need to find out more about a particular aspect. Now, on the UK BIM Framework website, we have got other resources. So we've also got the information protocol that we can use with Part 2, the delivery phase, and an information protocol that we can use to implement Part 3, the operational phase. Now, these are the only two information protocols that are completely aligned with the UK BIM framework. And really importantly, they can be used with any suite of contracts, and they can be used with bespoke contracts. So if you haven't seen the templates, do take a look at them. They are supported by guidance and are really user-friendly, and they are designed to be used back to back. So the same template can be used, for instance, to appoint a main contractor, and a main contractor can use the same template to support their subcontractors. We've got in information management assignment matrix, we've got information requirements examples, and earlier in the year we published examples that were particularly focused on health and safety aspects. And sticking with the theme of health and safety, We have been working with members of HSE this year to publish their guidance, which is around developing project information requirements that are focused on health and safety matters. Now, what's coming next for the guidance? Well, the Part 1 concepts guidance, that was the first guidance that we launched, and it is definitely due an update, and we are planning to get that guidance updated and released in Q1 2023. I'm anticipating it will look quite different to what it looks like at the moment, if not just because we've now got all these more detailed pieces of guidance that go into the nuts and bolts, and so we can slim down that Part 1 concepts guidance. But also we've got more information now around aspects such as level of information need that we can explore in a bit more detail in that concepts guidance. Also in Q1 2023, we're going to be looking to publish the guidance that Nick is going to be leading on, which is around information exchange and ISO 19650 Part 4. And also either later this year or very early next year, we'll be publishing guidance about mobilisation activities, which is an aspect that we need to bring in. I think it's going to come into guidance Part E around mobilisation, because of course we need to make sure that we're all mobilised and ready to go before we actually start producing information. So watch this space, that will be released. And if we come across any more FAQs, we'll be keeping that list of FAQs updated as well. So the last thing that I will say is that if you're listening to this and you're thinking, actually, there's something that I think the guidance doesn't cover, or I think this aspect is really important, we need to explore it further, or you'd just like to be involved in providing feedback on guidance, we would really welcome your involvement. So if that's you, please do get in touch with us through the email address that you can see on screen now. And I would really encourage you to go and take a look at the UK BIM Framework, have a wander around the guidance. We're always thinking about the user interface, how we can improve its navigation. It's now fully digital, supported by Notion. That's a new development this year, but of course we can improve it. So we can look at how we navigate the guidance because of the particular persona we might be adopting. And we can look at layering the guidance so that we've got the more high-level principles supported by the technical requirements. So I hope that you've enjoyed this very brief presentation, and we would love to hear from you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Our third and final speaker this evening is Nick Nisbet. I think the cliche goes that Nick possibly needs no introduction, but I'm going to play safe and introduce him anyway. Nick has been involved in the development of standards and guidance for information management for many, many years. And he has been, as I said earlier, the lead author on the development of Part 4. And so it's a great pleasure to have Nick with us this evening to talk us through Part 4 and how it can help people to meet some of the requirements that Sarah and Dan have been outlining, and indeed perhaps how it might help with some of the other emerging requirements under things like the Building Safety Act. So without any further ado, Nick, information exchange.
Thank you. And I've given myself an extra subtitle of Trust and Collaborative BIM. So although I probably will get technical, because that's my job, there are also some high-level ideas that I think we can draw from the ISO 19650 standard and Part 4 in particular. As ever with these things, I'm delighted to find that my first slide the thunder has been stolen from it, but I'll just say that if we ask the question, what do collaborative BIM need to do, the answer comes in three parts. We need to address the whole life cycle. We need to make sure that the information that we're developing and preserving actually serves people in the broadest sense. The second thing we need to do is to make sure it supports collaborative working. We need a process that actually establishes and allows people to work in a collaborative way. And I'll have quite a bit to say about that. And the third thing is we need information management, of course. And whilst many people put in this triad people, process, and technology, I'm inclined when I can to strike it out and say, no, it's people, process, and information, because that's what we're about. We're supporting the construction sector, the built environment, with information. Now we can start to look at part 4, and I'll just say a few words about the scope and introduction. Whenever there is an ISO or BSI standard, the scope and introduction gives you the clues, the signposts to what people are trying to achieve. The feedback may be that we haven't, but what we're trying to do is to really focus on the process and especially the decision-making criteria for each individual information exchange, because we want to ensure the quality of the project or asset information model. So by thinking about criteria, we're shifting the focus perhaps from process towards actual outcomes in terms of information. We also want it to secure the benefits arising from collaborative and interoperable building information modeling. We have that technology. We need to make the best of it. I think just broadening our sights a little bit wider, we want to promote a proportionate and sustainable approach to information exchange, where the immediate delivery of information does not limit its future use. In other words, we need to think of information as existing in its own right, and then we can look after it properly. So a bit more about collaborative BIM and what Part 4 tries to do. First of all, we want to support current and future users of the information. So we introduced a different terminology from the other parts, and we just talk about information providers, information reviewers, and information receivers. We all take different roles. We all change our positions with regard to the project and asset management. But for actually thinking about information exchanges, these are the 3 roles we need to think about. We also need to support current and future uses. And so, as the previous slide hinted, it really launches information sustainability. Meeting the immediate information need, you may be contracted, you may be appointed, whatever it is, but you need to meet that immediate information need without compromising the medium or longer term ability to use the information for economic, social, or environmental sustainability. Excuse me. What do I mean by the medium term? All information that you collect in a stage of the project is there to prime the next stage. All the information you collect during the trigger events, during the asset management phase, is there to support the next events that come along. And lastly, yes, the longer term is when we start to think about full sustainability. So one of the words that I picked up from the earlier presentations was trustworthy. And one of the aims of parts 1, 2, 3, and 5 is to support or protect and encourage trustworthy behavior by people. So we try and set up the rules that information containers are read-only, except for updates by the author. We try and set it up that information is shared early and often with a clear suitability attached to it. We try and suggest that information containers keep the same name so that the information doesn't appear or disappear from underneath you. And lastly, it has its history securely logged. Now, all these aspects of parts 1, 2, and 3, and 5 are really trying to create an environment where people can trust a collaborative process. what Part 4 tries to do is to extend that idea to creating trustworthy and protected information models, so that information containers are, as we know already, planned and of a finite, limited number. That's what information delivery planning is about. They're named in a predictable way. We know that parts 2 and 3 already encourage that, have a definite author, but this is where part 4 really comes into its own. They are checked against explicit criteria. If we're going to have contractual information exchange or simply adequate information exchange, we need to make sure that the checking process is robust. And of course, those of you who know your CDE process will know that the checking comes after work in progress, before you share the information, and after sharing, before publication. So we want to complement the idea of the CDE as being a machine for generating trust between people, to also making sure that it's a machine for generating trustworthy information. How do we do that? Well, 2 detailed diagrams. The first one should be familiar to anyone who's thought about the CDE, that basically information flows from work in progress to be shared and then published. But what Part 4 does is it looks carefully at those decision points at A and B and says what actually has to happen there. And the implication is that we want the maximum amount of quality assurance built into work in progress. So, but whatever in proportion to that, we need to make sure there is quality control at that decision point, quality control when the information is in a shared state, and then quality control before it's published. We can say more about those 2 decisions. The decision point A by the task team leader requires that the information is shared with an appropriate status or suitability. It's got to be in a coherent state, and it should be shared early in a delivery stage or operational event, and often when changes have been made. The when changes have been made is just a reminder that re-uploading all your information on a Friday is not conducive to collaborative working. Decision point B has a different set of rules. You still need to make sure that any transition assigns the appropriate status, of course. You only do it when the information is fit for approval, and you want to do it late in a delivery stage or operational event, and you want to do it only once. Those 2 sets of rules maximizes the time that information spends in the shared state. And actually, the strength of the CDE process is that the time that the information spends in the shared state allows corrections, comments, coordination, synchronization with everyone in the team. What criteria do we need at points A and B? Well, there are criteria that come from the standards, the project information standards, shared resources, production methods and procedures, and EIR. And much of that forms information criteria. But what Part 4 does is put special emphasis on the things that you might not write down. The rules, it emphasizes 6 sets of criteria, starting with making sure that the CDE rules are followed. Second area of compliance is making sure that information is conformant to the schema or format or layout that's required. There are criteria given around continuity, making sure that things don't spontaneously move. XYZ origins have been known to spontaneously move between a concept design and detailed design. A colleague of mine in the contracting industry has said that he's never had a set of models or drawings that actually aligned. So we've got a lot of work to do on continuity. We need to make sure the basic communications are successful. Things like the formats of dates. Don't use American dates in the UK. Don't use UK dates in America. Use ISO dates. And basic things like that, character sets and so on. We want to have consistency. We don't want unevenness in the information delivery. Don't provide furniture in half the rooms. Simple rule. And consistency, making sure that the interfaces between your federated models or whatever are accurately modeled. And the last set of criteria is completeness. Possibly the toughest one because it crosses the boundary or with what the EIRs may specify. But we need to make sure that when we exchange information, particularly as status or suitability rises, that they are heading towards completeness. Now, there's an extra dotted box on the diagram which just says other criteria. We wanted to remind people, lest they forget, that actually there are other criteria for the built environment, like will it stand up, will it accommodate the activities it's intended to, and so on. When I had a chance to review the criteria checklists for a major road project, I found that they were applying 100 criteria to each information exchange. 98 of them related to graphics, format, font style, spelling, line weights. Only 2 of them related to whether the bridge would stand up. So we wanted to at least mention that although it's not in the scope of Part 4, there are real criteria as well as information criteria. The standard has an informative annex about open schema and data format standards, and I'll come to why in a moment. And I'll also mention that it has been published in the UK with a national annex that has been agreed by the B555 committee of BSI. Also mentioned earlier, Sarah mentioned mobilization and testing. If we're going to have trustworthy information, we've got to make sure that our information exchanges work. So there are things to check, that the tools you're using can export the requested schemas and data formats. Check that the use of the schemas and formats support import of data, or the federation of the data, or the cross-linking of data. And of course, we are also getting serious about issue and risk register management, and we need to make sure the tools we use interact with those management tools. In order to encourage those capabilities, we emphasize in the standard open schema and data formats. Of course, we allow for proprietary or native data formats, but we put a caveat on it where this does not disadvantage the immediate or future uses. So I think this encourages people to think about data existing outside of applications and existing well into the long term. My last set of comments are to introduce the UK National Annex. This sits alongside the National Annex to Part 2, and it has 4 main topics. The first one is that we actually get to specify how classification should be applied. And it's really hard, it really seems to confuse people, but there is a requirement or an expectation that the information containers should be classified, and we have a uniclass table called the PM table to do that. It also gets very specific about the classification of the contents of information containers. And it gets specific about that and recommends the EF table, the SS table, the PR table, the CO table, the SL table, etc. And so it actually lists out where they can be used. It also steals from BS 8536 the table of stages. So there's a definitive list of how the stages and the life cycle of the project should be named. There are a few other UK conventions mentioned: geolocation, linear referencing, and not that you could actually believe that anyone sane would suggest otherwise. It also emphasizes metric units. The third area that the National Annex addresses is the completeness of a definition of completeness, so as to make sure that the Federation strategy includes all systems, all zones, and if you're in the process side of the industry, contracting or managing, all of the work packages, so that we don't get partial exchanges claiming to be complete. The last point, which I need to emphasize, of course, is that this standard actually supersedes PAS 1192 Part 4, which was entitled the UK Use of COBie. The role of COBie is unchanged. And so there is a clause in the National Annex that emphasizes that COBie remains the preferred format, schema for handover and closeout at stage 6. It then refers to definitions of COBie that are in the US National BIM standard and additional resources that are available from the Building Smart UKI website, etc., etc. So the status of COBie is unchanged in the UK BIM framework, and so on. Okay, so that actually concludes the technical points. I hope not too technical about Part 4. And I think that probably means that we're now going to shift to a question and answer format. Thank you very much.
It does mean that, Nick. So if you'd like to come and join me, and also Dan, and we're also going to be joined for the discussion by David Churcher, who was mentioned a little earlier as one of those who's been very involved in the guidance on the UK BIM framework. So, David, thank you for joining us.
Not at all.
Now, I'm going to try and deal with questions that we've had submitted in advance, and I've also got the potential for questions to come in online. So if you have got questions, please do use the chat function, and they'll get flagged up to me in the room. So, Nick, I'm going to start with a slightly administrative question, really, and I don't know whether this is one for you or for Dan, but clearly 19650 Part 4 is going to supersede PAS 1192 Part 4. If people are currently using PAS 1192 Part 4 on a project, does this mean they've got to stop and change, or is there some slightly more manageable transition arrangement?
Well, let Dan answer the technical question, and then I'll give some advice.
So I think the practical way of dealing with it is that it'll obviously depend on what your contract says, because the way that British standards work will be that if it's an undated reference, you should be using the most recent version that's been published, whereas if you put a dated reference in the contract, it's clear which one that is. I'm often reminded that projects like Crossrail, as an example, started before iPads existed. So there may be long, large programs of work that might reference standards that aren't necessarily current, but for practical reasons where they might want the continuity, it makes perfect sense to continue using what you have in your contract in that way. At the same time, if you've been given the flexibility of using the most recent and up-to-date good practice that is available, you now have a document that is more up to date with better referencing. I think makes that relationship to the NBIM's COBE schema and stuff a tad clearer as well. So I would suggest that, you know, if you're starting a new project, or perhaps have that flexibility, referring to this newer document makes the most sense, but you shouldn't throw out everything just because a new standard's been published either.
Dan, would you be happy if I summarised what you've just said as use a bit of common sense? Or is that oversimplifying?
Optimistic.
Well, I'm reminded of my primary school teacher who used to say that common sense is not so common. But I think in essence, yes.
Great. Nick, do you want to pick up on any of that?
Yeah, only to say that there is no change. The BS 1192 Part 4, it was a full British standard, referred to the US documentation as the definitive documentation, and that remains the case. A lot of the standard was providing education and guidance for the industry in the UK, for whom COBE was new. I think the industry is now more familiar with it. And the other thing that struck me as we went through this process was that the British standard was still referring to the old Uniclass classification. And since the delivery of information, the value of the delivery of information depends heavily on it being well classified, it really was necessary to update the references to classification, and that's what the National Annex to Part 4 does.
Right. Thanks, Nick. David, is there anything that you'd want to pick up on, and particularly, how is this going to be reflected in the UK BIM Framework guidance?
Thank you, Hal. Well, I mean, the idea of standards changing while the UK BIM Framework, or even prior to that, the BIM Level 2 standards in the UK, this is not new. So we've been tackling this issue of applying a changing standards landscape over practical project implementations. And in fact, the guidance from the UK BIM Framework has always been the same. If you've got a clear direction in your contract about what standards to use, then that is your first port of call. But if you do have more flexibility and it's you can make a business case for the change that's going to be necessary to switch from one version of a standard to another, then of course you should be considering it.
Great. Thank you all for those comments. Another question that's come in asks how this document, perhaps how this standard, is going to help more efficient BIM implementation on projects. Now, I wonder who wants to go first on that.
Well, I think there are two things we want from BIM implementations. We want efficiency and we want accuracy. The CDE process encourages that efficiency, but the checking criteria that Part 4 emphasizes is the thing that's going to give us accuracy. I think it should help the industry come to grips to the idea that industry is expected to deliver information in the most useful form, and accuracy and efficiency should become more and more possible. One of the ideas behind BIM is that it is inherently more checkable than documentation.
And I think at the risk of calling back a political joke somewhere, I agree with Nick. Thank you. But I think it's the check-in bit that I find most useful with this. And I think that while Nick referenced before that infrastructure projects that had the requirements for the line weights and the font sizes, I think that's part of what makes the standard work well, is that someone knows when they're checking that document to check those line weights and font sizes. You know, I think the moral of the story is there should also be questions about hopefully it won't burn down and can it stand up, but that doesn't take away the fact that someone's actually been given the tools to know these are the things that have been asked for, these are the requirements of the project, I probably should check for these. And I think that's what we're trying to do is as part of making information exchanges more practical, is providing the tools along the check-in and through the bits around common data environment, the distilling, sharing, maintaining, revising elements of it as well so that it all can work together more cohesively.
That's great. I should just comment that I think that political joke was a few prime ministers ago now. I might come back to your comment on things burning down a bit later, but I think we may have a question from one of those in the room, and we'll just get the microphone to work. And then if you could just introduce yourself and say who you are, and then ask the question.
Yeah, my name is Victor Alasia from OpenText. And I was just wondering, since it is a information exchange standard, if it has any electronic data interchange specifications between system to system, like suppliers to the CDE or supplier to the asset owner.
So I think I heard most of that question, asking about whether it has some form of electronic data exchange standard element to it. And Nick will come in with more detail, but I think that's why there are references to the open data schema and other aspects in there, so that if you were looking to something, things like using JSON or you're going through using the IFC schema and other bits and pieces are specifically signposted for those sorts of reasons.
Yes, the standard, I didn't dwell on it, but the standard has an informative annex which draws out some particular formats that are useful and some particular schemas are useful. Being active in building smart, IFC is in there, but it also mentions standards from the Open Geospatial Consortium and a number of other more specific exchange formats. The ISO, this informative annex, mentions COBE, it mentions CAFM Connect, which is the German equivalent, it mentions a number of others, in order to suggest to people that they should be considering open formats and schemas wherever possible, because of that question of information sustainability.
So Nick, is it fair to say that what we're aiming to do here is to standardise what is done and what is achieved, and not get into too much detail of exactly how you do it, so there may be more than one way to achieve the desired outcomes? Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. I see it as being primarily a data standard, which complements the process standards that are the other parts. And I think the industry is moving quite rapidly to adopting the ways and means, or lots of different ways and means of generating sustainable information.
Thanks, Nick. I think David wants to come in.
Yes, I mean, I think what you've asked there is actually the nub of the distinction between what we have in the standards and what we have in the guidance. So all of the standards in the 19650 series, bar part 1, which is about concepts and principles, are setting out specifications of things to be achieved without saying too much about exactly how that's going to be done. And that's where the guidance comes in, to try and fill that gap, to give some examples and reflections on actual practice, and give people a few hooks to try and implement the requirements of the standards in their own environment. So, yeah, exactly that.
The reason I ask the question is because one of the criticisms that is sometimes levelled at the framework, people find it complicated and think it's prescriptive. And I think what you've just explained to us is actually it's not. It's setting out some outcomes and giving people quite a bit of freedom to work out how to achieve it.
Yes, I mean, I think we need to be careful between a lot of the outcomes are prescriptive.
Yes,
in that
absolutely.
you've got a particular level of achievement to reach. But how you actually get there is very much up to the industry, the individual organisations to do it for themselves in the best way that suits them.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. I think we have another question in the room.
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes?
So, Aysar Abukhair, I from A-Site. Also wanted to follow up on Nick's presentation earlier. You crossed off the word technology and you replaced it with the word information. I have to say I also agree with you, like Dan said, but maybe we should also perhaps not ignore the role of technology in improving the accuracy of the information. And I was wondering if you, I mean, coming from a technology vendor, I would always welcome any kind of suggestions or perhaps recommendations for technology providers. What do you think we should be focusing on to improve the accuracy of this information?
Well,
Do you want to go first, Nick?
I'll go first. I think the first thing is to make sure that the CDE process is correctly implemented and secured against backdoors, shortcuts, and all the other things that people attempted to introduce. I think the other thing about the technology is that we need the technology to help with checking and consistency. There are some tools already, but they've got to become much more widespread. A CDE process that doesn't apply checking isn't going to produce a trustworthy information model. And so I think there are lots of opportunities for thinking about how that can best be done. My belief is that it's a lot easier to check a BIM model than a set of drawings, and I've been employed to do both on many occasions, and I remember the pain of trying to check a set of drawings. So I think the opportunity here is to help people build in checking processes, maybe storing the results systematically, so that there's an evidence that you did that checking as well. So I think for years, I think we've had systems or lack of systems in the industry, which meant the only person who could check a piece of work was someone of the same grade, qualification, and so on, who will answer the question, is that what I would have done in those circumstances? We need to find more ways of automatic checking. I also mentioned briefly quality assurance. I think we need more tools that ensure that the right information and the right design is created in the first place. Because quality assurance is, on the whole, a lot cheaper than quality control.
Thanks, Nick. Dan?
I'll join in briefly. I'll put out that I love technology. Easy start. But I think what we want the technology to do is be an enabler to make the process easier and better. And what I find sometimes is that the technology can go 80% there, but then it confounds the issue sometimes with either extra wizardry or extra bits and pieces on there that might detract from the core purpose sometimes. And some examples, in a way, I think one of the things Nick talked about was the idea that if it has a unique name, it shouldn't be able to be renamed. And actually, I think if we opened all the softwares that can work as common data environments and see, actually, can you rename stuff once it's been given a name? The answer is, well, probably. So it's gone 80% of the way, but it hasn't got that last bit. And there are lovely standards out there that relate to document management that I think some of these tools don't follow. And one close to my heart is EN 82045 Part 2. Great standard, brilliant read, thank you. And it has in it like an express schema for metadata for files for document management. And there's a lot of conversation about, well, what happens if you have more than one solution on a project and you can't share files? So I say, well, there's this solution that's been around for at least 15 years that tells you what all the properties should be and how to record them in a kind of machine-friendly way to enable that. But again, if you looked at all those software, how many of them do you think follow and align to that convention? The answer is probably none of them. And I think there's a mix of following the standards that are available, but also following the purpose. And sometimes it might mean upsetting the customer who wants to be able to do a thing, but not being able to do that is kind of the point of having access to it in the first place. And obviously you don't want to upset people, but at the same time, I think it's trying to follow that rigor for Nick's point around accuracy and finding things and everything else. And just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should in some of these places.
Do you want to pick up on anything, David?
I'm not sure I'm qualified, actually.
In which case, I'll let you off the hook, and I'm going to make a comment because Dan ran us through some of the public sector things, and I made a brief comment when I was introducing Nick about the Building Safety Act, and the term hasn't come up yet this evening, but I'm going to mention it. There is this requirement for the golden thread for higher risk buildings as defined in the Act, which I'm not going to go into in detail now. But quite simply, there is a requirement to have information about these buildings that is available to enable the people operating them to keep them safe. Now, exactly what that information is will vary from building to building. One of the real concerns is, are we setting about defining the information needs and the processes for delivering that information first, and then asking, and what technology is available to support that? Or are we allowing the technology to lead us? And I think if we're going to get robust solutions and get the golden thread to work, it has to be the first way round. We define what we need and then we use technology to implement it, and not do, as I fear some are doing, and I don't have your systems in mind, but I think we've got to avoid allowing technology to try to lead us on this journey. The technology has got to support us on the journey, is my view. And I'm seeing some nodding heads on the panel, so I haven't said anything too outrageous. Now, I do want to pick up a couple of the other questions that have come in to me prior to today. There was a question about whether there's a plan for Part 5, and I think you covered that, Dan.
Yes.
Do you just want to say a little bit more about what Part 5 does, and perhaps expand that into the question of security considerations? Because I know people can get concerned, we're putting all of this information into this model, what if an untrustworthy person gets onto it? How do we guard ourselves against that?
Good question. So I think to start with our first bit, which is that, as we talked about, 19650 Part 5 is already available. And what it covers is that idea of security mindedness. And there is somewhat of a antagonistic kind of relationship between wanting to share information, but also wanting to ensure that things are secure. Yeah. And I think that's where existing mechanisms like information requirements come in, because what we're trying to say is, this is the information that I need for a particular purpose. And I think there's a very interesting bit that I think appears, it might be in the guidance, I don't think it's necessarily in the standards per se at this point, which is, if you're producing an information container and it doesn't help satisfy an information requirement, why are you doing it in the first place? So actually, I think there's an interesting bit of, are you only making things that help? Yeah. And then at that point, you can start to look at some of the standards and tools that support security mindedness, and that can include things like document marking and handling. So do you set it as something that's publicly available because you might want to stick it into the planning consultation? Is it a restricted document? Is there a circulation list? Is the asset sensitive because you've gone through that triage process that you have to do if you're working on a project that's following the information management mandate? And then at that point, have you developed your security management plan that has all these extra checks and balances put in there before information actually perhaps even leaves work in progress, shared or similar in that way? So I think there are a number of process elements that can help. But what I'll also mention is there's lots of interesting work around what's happening with the National Digital Twin Programme that's looking at this as well, because it's not just about being able to share it, but making sure that what you're sharing is appropriate for other people to see, who is allowed to see it, and that relationship. But you want to be able to share, and this is a spirit I hear Nick talk about often, is you want to be able to share freely and often within the context that you're permitted to. And I think we want to encourage people to share their information, but to do so in a security-minded and considerate way.
And perhaps that leads to the other phrase, you're sharing with the right people the right information.
Yes,
At the right time. And at the right time, absolutely. David, do you want to add anything on the framework guidance around security?
Well, only to say that I think Sarah touched on it in her video presentation, that the guidance around the security standard is hosted by the CPNI on their website. So it's not all at the ukbimframework.org as the rest of the guidance is. And we have an active dialogue with CPNI to make sure that we've got good guidance across the piece.
And for anyone not familiar, that's the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure.
Indeed.
I'm just conscious we've got people online who are not necessarily from the UK and may not even use metric units. I think we have another question in the room, please.
Hi, everybody. Arushan Mahendrakumar from A-Site. Firstly, I agree with the point around how technology should be enablers for the processes being defined. So my point is, so again, there was anything that helps us as technology providers, anything that helps us automate and essentially gain efficiencies through technology, I think I'm a big fan of. So I think Part 4 is one of these tools that enable us to automate a lot and again, encourage machine-readable exchange of information. And the other standard that's really interesting is around the level of information need, which is around how do I define how my information requirements to essentially create purpose-driven information containers. So I just wanted to know how you see what the differences firstly are between level of information requirements and the standards related to information exchange, and what do you think are the similarities between the two and the consistencies between the two?
I think Nick's keen to come in.
Well, I think the industry has had to grapple with how to express their information requirements. With the introduction of CAD, let alone BIM, suddenly all the old assumptions that we all knew what a 1 to 200 drawing looked like, whatever your discipline or whatever, that's all gone, and we've had to think again. And we're trying to change the industry to being a lean industry, and the idea of lean means asking the customer what their requirements are. That's the oil tanker that we've had to turn around in the last a decade or so, is to actually get people to express requirements. I think what's exciting now is that we're seeing a renewed interest in being systematic about requirements, organizing them properly. I would mention ISO 12911, which is not in the framework, but it should be, guys, which actually gives a framework for being really methodical about requirements without them expanding into very, 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 very long spreadsheets, which I don't think is always conducive to accuracy or efficiency. I also think it's interesting that Building Smart is coming back with an electronic standard called Information Delivery Specification, which should allow users, there are interfaces online where you can create IDS requirements files so that they can be checked automatically. And I think that's the start of the next wave. As we get serious about information, we can get serious about machine-readable information requirements. I'm passionate about human and machine-readable requirements. But I think, that's the next wave, to say that we start implementing those tools.
Yeah, I think the long answer, because it's never a short answer when I start, the long answer is they all work together. So when you have things like the exchange information requirements from a 19650 point of view, you're trying to schedule out what information that you need as a client, appointing party, in that sort of way. As Nick mentioned, you have things like ISO 12911 that starts to allow you to structure that, where you can say, I'm exchanging for this reason, these are the things that are applicable, these are the things that you can cast aside, and these are the actual requirements. So it allows you to start to structure that, but then what the level of information need does, it gives you the language to then describe what that requirement actually is. Because it's quite difficult to maybe say, well, what I need you to do is stick on a drawing these things, but not those things, and have it at this detail, but also give me the related document that also needs to have this inside of it. And that's the language that level information need will hopefully give us as part of that. And when Nick talked about IDS, formerly Information Delivery Manuals, IDM, from Building Smart point of view, they were exchange requirements. And there's a bit of confusion between EIRs and ERs in that sometimes. And I think the point often is that when you look at an information delivery manual, it talks about all the requirements across all the actors in a process. So if you were submitting to building control, it's the relationship between all the actors in that, where an EIR is really between two people. It's the appointer telling the appointee what they want. So there's a lot of Venn diagram overlaps between these, but I don't think any of them are conflicting or contradictory. They serve different purposes. 19650 is very much in a contractual relationship. IDMs and IDSs can be contractually agnostic because it's describing you do a thing, these are the exchanges and processes to achieve that thing, but both of them can use level of information need to describe the amount of information stuff they need as part of those processes. But I think it's just navigating through those various standards, pulling the bits together to make that cohesive yield. But I think it's achievable.
I think if I could just add to that, I mean, what I'm sort of thinking about from hearing those sort of answers from you, Nick and Dan, and to the question, is to re-emphasize the sort of amount of engagement that this process requires, particularly from those who are sitting in the client's seat or the asset owner's seat, who maybe traditionally have been less engaged because they've been able to be less engaged. But this is a process where we're trying to bring together a table of equals rather than clients in effect delegating everything to their technical experts and contractors and consultants, and then not really having any control over the direction of travel that's then brought out in that project or asset through its life. So it's to me much more about encouraging those clients and asset owners to step up and sort of be accountable and take responsibility for the things that they should know and the things they should be able to explain to their supply chains.
So, David, can I play devil's advocate here and ask, from a client perspective, you're asking me to get more engaged. Bluntly, more engagement means more of my time, so that's a cost. What's in it for me as a client that is going to make me think this is a good thing and not, oh, flipping heck, this is going to cost me more, why should I do it?
Well, I think if you were a client who had got a long track record of perfectly delivered projects that were always on budget or even under budget, delivered on time and did exactly what you originally set out for them to achieve, then I might perhaps take your point. But I think a lot of clients wouldn't find themselves in that position. All sorts of things happen, all sorts of problems that are ultimately avoidable with good planning, with good communication between the various parties. And those sorts of streamlinings and elimination of wasteful activities are leading to the cost benefits that are coming out of information management that have been demonstrated through trial projects and so forth.
So I think what I'm hearing is that instead of me having to sort out messes further down the line,
Yeah.
you're encouraging me to put a bit of effort in up front to specifying my information requirements and how it's all going to be managed, with the potential that I won't have messes to sort out further down the line. I might even get better buildings out of it. Is that the offer?
Indeed it is, yes. And I think if you thought about what happens in a manufacturing environment, a lot of time and effort is spent planning and thinking about how a product is going to be manufactured, it's going to be made, it's going to be packaged, it's going to be sold, because once that production line starts running, stopping it costs a fortune.
Yep.
So we're not really in exactly the same position in the built environment sector, but with the emergence of off-site and other sorts of technologies which are more in the manufacturing arena, it's more important than ever that we have this discipline and sort of structured approach.
And perhaps we don't have a production line, but once a building has, once there's a significant defect,
Yeah.
then putting it right is expensive, even on a prototype. So,
Indeed, and think about the enormous sums of money that have been talked about for correcting cladding defects from high-rise risk buildings. I mean, billions and tens or indeed hundreds of billions to put right, which could have been avoided.
yeah, and actually the money is only part of it.
Of course.
The cost in human misery is probably incalculable.
Indeed.
And, better outcomes don't just have financial implications.
Absolutely right.
I'm conscious that time is moving on, and I think I'd like to finish up by probably turning to Dan, but also David will want to chip in on this. There's a lot of information that we've been given tonight about standards and guidance and publicly available specifications. And it might be helpful just to summarise where people can go to get their hands on some of this information. I know some of it's in the slides, so some of the answer is look at the slides when they're available. But Dan and David, do you want to finish off? And Nick, if you've got anything to add at the end, please do.
I mean, I'll start with three places for now, which is the first will be go into the UK BIM Framework website. Is probably a very useful starting point. One, because it lists the standards, guidance and tools, but also because it's going to be ever-changing. The second, slightly more nepotistic one is that you could always go on my Twitter account and ask me questions, and I will tell you. Thank you for that. And I think maybe the third useful one might be that through NEMA, formerly the UK BIM Alliance, there are community groups that are geographical communities as well as domain-specific communities, in the way that they're set up for that kind of outreach and engagement. And if people are interested, I think it's approaching NEMA, finds out where the appropriate groups are, and then speaking to like-minded people who may be either geographically close to you or close to the line of work you're doing through the respective domains, and then having the engagement that way. So those are probably my three favourite places.
Thank you, Dan. And given that answer, David might want to agree with you, Dan.
Well, I'd certainly agree with everything you've said so far. I think clearly the UK BIM Framework website would be my first recommendation. I mean, that when you're looking at the standards, which we mustn't forget, of course, then the pointers there are in the UK, to the BSI website to actually obtain the standards if you haven't got them already. But then I think the less formal mechanisms, such as social media, but also there's a whole host of industry-developed material, CPD, webinars and so forth, which are all available in various topics. So it's almost a case of where not to go, almost, I think.
Go on, Nick.
I'd just like to also mention Building Smart UK and Ireland, which is part of NEMA, and it has guidance about COBE. It has guidance about how asset owners can get into information management, even if it's an existing old asset, and so on. There's a guidance on use of COBie with infrastructure, and there are templates and so on. So it's a community, and it's also, sorry, I should also say it's a community of like-minded people who have been serious about information sustainability for 27 years. So that's also a very good resource.
Thanks, Nick. And I think Dan mentioned earlier that he's involved in the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists, and I know there's material on their website. CIBSE has information on this on our website. There may well be other professional bodies doing this, but you know, there's a lot of material out there. Please do make good use of it. I think at that point, I'm going to wind up the proceedings. I'd like to say a few thank yous. Thank you, first of all, in her absence, to Sarah for her contribution. Thank you very much here and with us to Nick and Dan for your presentations. And thank you, David, for coming and joining us on the panel and contributing. And finally, I'd like to thank the BSI team who've put this together. These things are never that straightforward, and there's a lot of hard work gone on in the background. So thank you to the BSI team, particularly Dr. Anna Fricker, who chairs the BSI, who is the committee manager for the BSI committee. Thank you, Anna, for all of your hard work. So I think with that, it remains to say thank you very much to everybody who's come online, to those who are in the room. I do hope that's been helpful. I believe that some of the materials will be available for you online afterwards. And I wish you a pleasant rest of the evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.